Today, Matt Cochrane and I are reuniting to discuss another book. This one's Liar's Poker. Liar's Poker is Michael Lewis's first book, and it was about his stint at Salomon Brothers. He worked there for a few years in the mid 1980s. The book chronicles an extraordinary boom on Wall Street. So, like, to put some context in this, Wall Street, or the stock market, markets in general, were very stagnant from the late 60s through the early 1980s. And all of a sudden, everything started to boom again once Volcker conquered inflation and Reagan was putting in tax cuts. And then there was this extraordinary boom. And Michael Lewis gives you a view into what this was like, into what a crazy bonanza it was. The world has changed a lot since then, but I think a lot of the themes and trends identified in the book persist to this day and are very much alive. So I really enjoyed it. This book is a much change of pace from what Matt and I typically talk about, where we're usually talking about books that teach you good lessons. And this book is more about like kind of what to avoid and some of the traps you could fall into and how a business is poorly run. Yeah, so I think this will be a pretty interesting conversation. So anyway, that's my point of view on the book. What did you think, Matt?
Well, first of all, Value Stock Geek, thank you very much for having me again. I always enjoy going over our books with you and having these discussions. So I'll say this, like, for all of our books, except for the Charlie Mungers, right? Like, I'd read all of them multiple times already. And even Charlie Mungers, I kind of knew what I was getting myself into. This book, when you suggested it, I really didn't know anything about it. And so I kind of just read it without even researching it first, without knowing where it was going to go or anything like that. And I really enjoyed it. I'll say it took me a little bit to get into it. It starts off with the author, Michael Lewis. It's written from a firsthand perspective. And it's like his, like, basically like just getting hired onto Wall Street as an investment banker with the Salomon Brothers, and his like version of like how the training went there and how he got tired. And he are we allowed to I should have asked you this before the podcast. Are we allowed to use language on your podcast?
Yeah. I mark them all as explicit in case a guest drops, a curse word or something. It doesn't offend me at all. But yeah, I purposely mark them all like that just in case, so people feel free to talk however they want.
We might have to get there eventually.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of exploits that he talks about his peers or especially the higher execs at the Salomon Brothers. But it starts off like that, and it just took me a little bit to get into it. And then it breaks into basically how the Salomon Brothers fall into inventing mortgage bonds, which, like, again, I didn't know where the book was going. And that was just fascinating to me. One, because now we know with the benefit of hindsight, when he wrote this book, he did not. Like, that creation will eventually lead to the financial crisis, like 20 years, 25 years after this book takes place. And then it kind of goes back, but it's really a book about, I guess, the Salomon Brothers and like the hubris that it creates this monopoly of creating the mortgage bonds, creates this monopoly. It becomes a huge product. They're the only ones on Wall Street that really get it. And their hubris, like, basically leads not quite to their downfall, but like they really get humbled. The firm gets humbled and humiliated by the end of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So the mortgage bond section, I think, is the most interesting. I agree with you. It's the most interesting part of the book. And I suggested this because the next one I want to do is The Big Short. So we kind of get the intro.
After
and then
reading this, I want to read it. That is the next one I want to read too.
Yeah, so he's there on kind of the ground floor of this creation of this new product. And then he's also there 20 years later when this all completely blows up in our face. And yeah, so it was interesting. So to give some context for the listeners who haven't read the book, basically what Salomon Brothers did was they saw an opportunity where before the 1980s, you got a mortgage, you went to a bank, the bank looked at your financial situation, they wrote you a loan, and then they sat on that mortgage for 15, 30 years or whatever the term of your mortgage is. They receive your interest and principal payments. End of the story. That's the relationship. And Salomon Brothers basically invented this mortgage bond market where they would buy up mortgages from all of these different banks and financial institutions and thrifts and savings and loans, package them up in the bonds and sell them. And then they were out there identifying customers. So they had this weird product. And then originally in the beginning, it's very hard to get it going, but then they eventually identify markets for these things. And what that really does is it dramatically increases the amount of money pouring into the mortgage industry, into the housing industry, and creates this entirely new pool of capital flowing into it. And yeah, eventually it turns into this insane beast by the 2000s and blows up the economy.
Right. And I had it surprised me. So the book, again, it starts off firsthand. This is my training at Salomon Brothers, and this was my view of the executives. This was their view of me. He was like a peon, at this place. At the cool kids table was definitely all the bonds traders that were making the big deals. And then it just breaks away. He's like, well, he kind of sets it up like, well, this is what was happening at Salomon Brothers, and he goes back in time. And at that point, when he starts talking about the mortgage bonds, I was like, when was this book written? I'm like, is this written in hindsight? Like after the financial crisis, he realizes this is important, and it wasn't. It was written in the late '80s. I think this was Michael Lewis's, who's now written many many bestsellers. So I think this was his first book. It's just incredible how he was there and wrote about something that later becomes much more interesting, or much more important, I guess, in the financial world than I think he realized, or than he realized at the time. And then it goes back at the end, kind of his perspective on how the company fell from its lofty heights. They were the king of bonds basically on Wall Street, and they fall. And I'm sure we'll get into all that. But yeah, it was a really really interesting book. I really enjoyed this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other interesting trends so first of all, I'll say that I've listened to some podcasts with Michael Lewis, and he talks about, just to put this in the context, he talks about how he thought what he was chronicling in that book was kind of like an insane boom that was a moment in time that would never repeat itself. And what he says surprises him is that it basically just continued and got even bigger as time went on. Like he thought he was looking into something like the 20s or something. And okay, this is crazy. This is eventually going to fall apart. And yeah, I thought that was interesting, like how he talked, and what he calls it is like the financialization of the economy. So where finance and banking and investing becomes a bigger and bigger and bigger slice of the American economy. And that's kind of intensified through the late 2000s. So I thought that was an interesting trend. What you're seeing is more of like the beginning of a trend rather than like a moment in time.
And why the Salomon Brothers were perfectly positioned to be almost to me, the Goldman Sachs on Wall Street. And then they just complete within a span of a few years, completely blow it, with their hubris and with their kind of arrogance and being in the exactly right place at exactly the right time. They blow that huge advantage to be basically the monopoly of mortgage bond traders on Wall Street, and completely lose all that business within a few years. And it's that is pretty incredible to read, just on a higher level of how greed and arrogance and all that hubris can just lead to their downfall in such a short time. That really again, Warren Buffett makes a cameo in this book, and it's kind of like a scene, it's a scene stealing cameo, because he comes in basically and basically bails out Salomon Brothers at a very crucial time when they had a hostile takeover bid and were being taken over by corporate pirates, and they gets very very attractive terms on his bailout of the firm. But it's just, so all that is very very interesting.
Yeah. So what you get in the book is what happened in 87, 88 with Buffett's involvement. So what happened was they were in desperate need of capital. They were facing takeover bids from Drexel Burnham, which was run by Michael Milken, who was the king of junk bonds at the time. And they offered Warren Buffett this incredible deal where he could get preferred stock at this, tremendously high interest rate. And for Warren Buffett, it looked like a great deal. Now, what's not really covered in the book is what happens in the later on in the early 90s.
Right. I wanted the book to keep going to like read about this, but yeah, continue.
Yeah, so and I think that this is an interesting lesson from Warren Buffett's life, which you could read about in the books about him, like The Snowball or The Making of American Capitalists, where so he buys these Salomon bonds and he's like, wow, what a great deal. Like, it's high interest rate. Salomon gets bailed out, but he's buying into this grotesque culture. And the way I look at it, if you looked at it back then, you could have seen this might look good on the surface, man. Not a good idea. And ultimately what happens is there's a Salomon trader who basically tries to like manipulate the treasury market. And Salomon almost loses its access to being one of the key market makers in treasury bonds. And it almost implodes the entire firm. Warren Buffett ends up saving the company. He utilizes all of his reputation, all of his connections, and he has to spend a year that in the books I've read about him, he absolutely hated. He has to spend a year running Salomon. He's lives in New York, which he hates because he likes his life in Omaha. And I think it's just a good lesson like that. The main lesson I get from that whole story is culture matters in a company. You should take a hard look at that. Think about what you're buying into, even if the financials are appealing on the surface. If a company has a toxic culture, it's something you just want to avoid. That's what I got out of it.
I think that is maybe the biggest takeaway from the book is that culture matters. I think we're about to go through this thing, but like culture, like at the end of it, you're like, okay, yeah, culture, like this company, if we were evaluating it as an investment in 1985, 1986, I mean, just speaking for me, I guess, but like, and obviously we're not talking about valuation. I don't know how the stock was valued or anything like that, but it seemed like it had a corner on a very, very growing important part of the bond market. It was the most profitable firm on Wall Street at the time, as the book mentions over and over again. Per employee, they were just killing it, knocking it out of the park. And then their culture completely train wrecks the company within 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like an interesting aspect of the culture that I think Michael Lewis touches on later in the book is he's basically screwing over customers. He's selling things to them that he knows are bad investments. And then what the other traders tell him is like, well, who do you work for? Implying that like it's okay to screw over customers if it benefits Salomon Brothers. And like I think that there tells you about the whole culture of this place and what it was like.
We're fast forwarding. So yes, so now we're getting back. Michael Lewis is out of the training program.
Yeah.
He goes into like maybe 100 pages on the whole mortgage bond thing and how Salomon Brothers got to where they are. He becomes a trader and he becomes a pretty successful bond trader. But like he's talking about like the first time he makes a trade. And basically what had happened was Salomon Brothers, they're holding on to these really bad bonds. I think they were issued by AT&T at the time, but that's not really important. But like he's holding on to these bad bonds and the trader tells him something, so he makes this pitch to these bonds, to this, like, again, he's right off of the training program. He's never made a trade before, and this customer is about as new as he is, and he had just gotten a job managing money. So it's like this guy's first trade, and he basically like he convinces the guy to buy these bonds, and it becomes a horrible trade. And this guy gets fired. This customer gets fired because this trade was so bad that Michael Lewis pitches to him. So he goes back and he's really mad at the bond trader who gave him this advice to tell his customer. And you're right. The guy goes, "Who do you work for?" And just reading from the book, "Who do you work for?" That question haunted salesmen. Whenever a trader screwed a customer and the salesman became upset, the trader would ask the salesman, "Who do you work for anyway?" The message was clear. You work for Salomon Brothers. You work for me. I pay your bonus at the end of the year, so just shut up, you geek. All of which was true as far as it went. But if you stood back and looked at our business, This was a ridiculous attitude. A policy of screwing investors could lead to ruin. If they ever caught on, we'd have no investors. Without investors, we'd have no business raising money. The only justification, if you can call it that, I ever heard for our policy came unwittingly from our president, Tom Strauss himself, a former salesman of government bonds. At a lunch with one of my customers, apropos of nothing and everything, he offered this opinion: customers have very short memories.
Yeah. Yeah, which is crazy. Yeah, I guess they figured that a customer could get screwed over and would just say, whatever, I'll come back for some more, which is which is so crazy to think that that was their attitude.
Right, and that that comes up in other places of the book. So I think if you rewind, they create the mortgage bonds,
Hmm.
and they they're only at first there's no market, and in fact, I shouldn't say they were the only company on Wall Street that was doing this. They weren't. Like all the other firms started, the mortgage bonds became a thing.
Hmm.
So all the Wall Street firms tried to do it. It was nothing. It was like crickets. Nobody wanted to buy these things. They were brand new. Nobody knew how to trust them. And so all the other firms on Wall Street folded up shop. Like, well, this isn't anything. We thought it might be something. And for whatever reason, like Salomon Brothers, it's led by the mortgage bonds was led by a guy named Ranieri, and he started hiring all these people. Now again, he in the book, he's like, I don't know if he had the vision to do this. I don't know if it was like political for him because he just wanted a bigger department. It's unclear, but this guy named Ranieri, Louis Ranieri, a very big character in the book, he led the charge for mortgage bonds overall, and he just starts hiring all these people. So they have this huge mortgage bond department and no customers. And then finally, they start got customers, but only because they were buying from the savings and loans across America, but there was no one to sell for. And they're talking about like buying from these savings and loans people because there's a tax break created in the early 80s, and this is what created like the market for like them buying the bonds from the savings and loans. And the tax break gave the savings and loans breaks on like when they sold they basically got tax breaks, and any money they sold these mortgage bonds for, they could get tax breaks for that money. So they were just desperate to sell these things and recognize the tax breaks. And he goes, they didn't know the mentality. He's talking about the savings and loans presidents. He goes, they didn't know the mentality of the people they were up against. They didn't know the value of what they were selling. In some cases, they didn't even know the terms, years to maturity, rates of interest, etc., of their own loans. The only thing the thrift managers, those are the S&L managers, knew was how much they wanted to sell. The truly incredible thing about them, noted by all the Salomon traders, was that no matter how roughly they were treated, they kept coming back for more. They were like ducks I once saw on a corporate hunt that were trained to fly repeatedly over the same field of hunters until shot dead. You didn't have to be Charles Darwin to see that this breed was doomed.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you mentioned the other Wall Street banks were in on it and they were ready to give up, which is why Solomon Brothers,
Was
like
left with the monopoly, yeah.
yeah, they got a monopoly. And yeah, you're right. Like they didn't like Lewis doesn't know if Ranieri if Ranieri had the vision or not. And you're also right. Louis is a super interesting character. So he's basically the guy who builds this whole industry. And in some ways, his story is very inspiring. So he starts out in the mailroom of Salomon Brothers. He's like a working class guy. He starts out in the mailroom, goes to the back office, gets his way into the front office, and then he builds this whole industry. Yeah, and he's a pretty fascinating guy. I kind of liked him in some ways, but even though I know what this eventually leads to, but yeah, I thought he was an interesting character.
Definitely interesting. I mean, there's a lot of interesting characters,
Yeah.
and there was a lot to like about Ranieri. This part, so Ranieri's like he's trying to sell these mortgage bonds that nobody wants to buy yet, and it was basically like he had this pitch about like the American homeowner and how important this was, and the mortgage market's going to grow because all the baby boomers are coming of age now. They want to buy houses, and that the S&Ls across America, they literally did not have the money to lend to these people that needed to buy homes. And he was like, it was this great pitch, and everybody snickered. And he goes, except Ranieri actually believed it. Like
Hmm.
he believed this, and that's why he was so effective, like being the like evangelist of mortgage bonds, because he believed what he sold. You know, he and you're right. He came up from the back, like the mail room at Salomon Brothers, and like spoiler alert, he gets fired. Like as this starts to fall apart, you know, he might have been the guy to save Salomon Brothers. He might not have been. He makes the firm just a gazillion dollars, and he gets fired because he was almost growing too powerful in the firm, and that the others kind of just it's like all this political backstabbing and everything like that. But he was this missionary early on for these mortgage bonds because he just would like preach about the American homeowner and how important that was, and God bless the USA.
Yeah, and he even had a pull to get laws changed. So he's out
Yes,
there influencing Congress and states and trying to get legislation passed that will make all of this possible.
yes, yes, yes. Why would we should talk about why the book is called Liar's Poker.
Oh, yeah, 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 absolutely.
So it was a game that the traders at Salomon Brothers would play. And he goes, the game is a group of people, as few as two, as many as 10, form a circle. Each player holds a dollar bill close to his chest. The game is similar in spirit to the card game known as I Doubt It. And I'm not familiar with this game, just an aside, but like my kids play a game called Bluff, and it seems similar to that. Each player attempts to fool the others about the serial numbers printed on the face of his dollar bill. One trader begins by making a bid. He says, for example, three sixes. He means that all told, the serial numbers of the dollar bills held by every player, including himself, contain at least three sixes. And then it keeps going on, and they basically say like they can challenge like a claim that somebody makes, or the bids keep escalating. But the book, I think it literally starts on the trading floor of the Salomon Brothers, and the CEO goes up to like the head trader and wants to play a game for like, millions of dollars. Like, all right, let's settle this once and for all. Who's the best player of Liar's Poker? Like, let's like whatever. I think he said like $2.5 million, $3 million, and the trader comes back like $10 million. I'll play a game for $10 million. And then the guy, like the CEO, is like, "Oh, you're crazy," and just walks away. But like, that was the mentality on the trading floor of Salomon Brothers.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. The guy that so the CEO is John Goodfriend, and then the guy he makes this crazy bet with is John Merriweather. So interesting story about Merriweather. He goes on in the 90s to start long-term capital management, which is the hedge fund that blew up because they were leveraged like 30 to 1 and their bets didn't work out. So I think it just shows like, and he was widely considered to be like one of the smartest guys on Wall Street, and long-term capital management had all of these like Nobel Prize winners and PhDs and whatever. And I think it just shows you that like kind of like character is destiny. So if you have that kind of just loose approach towards risk, and you have like that kind of mentality, in some way it's going to blow up down the line. Is kind of how is what I took from it.
Yeah, yeah, no, 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 for sure. So maybe my favorite part of the book is like, so Salomon Brothers creates the mortgage bond business, and it finally takes off. And at the peak of it, it's describing like the attitude of the mortgage bond trader. So now they have this like have developed this air of superiority about them, and like and the way this took form was gluttony. He talks about the gluttony of these mortgage bond traders, and he says, just as some people are mean drunks, mortgage traders were mean gluttons. Nothing angered them more than being without food, unless it was being interrupted while they ate. In other words, they were not the sort of hyperthyroid fat people who meekly sip Diet Cokes all day and prompt one to ask, so how did he get fat? He never eats. Nor were they the sort of jolly fat people like Ed McMahon, who are loved because they don't threaten anybody. Mortgage traders were the sort of fat people who grunt from the belly and throw their weight around like sumo wrestlers. When asked to find food, a trainee on the mortgage desk simply brought back as much of everything as he could carry. And then it like later talks about like 8 a.m., like right off the bat, we start with onion cheeseburgers. And like everybody would just down an onion cheeseburger. And it's like, you get the quote from one of them. He's like, it's not like we wanted an onion cheeseburger at 8 a.m., but then somebody would buy them, and then they were there, and you would smell them, and everybody else was eating them. So you just have an onion cheeseburger. And then they would talk about like this Food Frenzy Friday, where they would just buy as much food as they could, like if it was Mexican food that day, they'd buy like a drum of guacamole and bring that, like, or a drum of salsa and bring that. He's like, we spend like $1,000 on Mexican food. He's like, you literally can't spend $1,000 on Mexican food, but we'd find a way to do it, and we would just eat all day. And if people called us up for trades, we told them, we can't do it today. We're eating. And it was just this total loss of all self-control on the trading floor of this like mortgage bond business for Salomon Brothers.
Yeah, and I think that really captures the whole culture of the place. It's just like greed and gluttony and everything just totally out
It
of
really
hand.
does. It really does. Or they would have what they called goofs, and which is just like this practical like jokes they would play on people. And it talks about like if somebody was going on a trip and they had their suitcase, they would like take out all their clothes and like fill it with like wet toilet paper so they go on a trip and they wouldn't have anything. Or like Ranieri, the guy we're talking about, he's walking down the hallway with like a broadsword, and he's just like cutting off neckties of like first time employees and things like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's almost like a lot like the Wolf of Wall Street is kind of what it reminded me of. If you've ever seen that movie, seems like a very similar culture.
It's very much, yes, it's very much like that. In fact, like I didn't know this, but like I was just trying to like after I read it, I was trying to just like research around. But Bonfire Vanities was like inspired by the Salomon Brothers during this time, and I was like, there you go. But yeah, it's very much that 80s Wall Street vibe, but just hearing it firsthand was just kind of incredible.
Yeah. So, do you think that culture is still alive in Wall Street? Do you think that fundamentally that's what it is? And what do you think about that?
I don't think as much, maybe, but man, maybe I'm being naive here. Like, look, I am sure there are a lot of excesses on Wall Street.
Hmm.
So don't, but I think the absolute excesses, maybe not as much. In fact, like, I think in some ways, you almost see it more in Silicon Valley now with the
Mm.
corporate excesses, like the personal masseuses, the baristas, and it's more. And don't get me wrong, in Silicon Valley, it's a more healthier version. Like there's people that make you smoothies in the morning, and I don't think it's as openly greedy or gluttonous or like more vices were present, or at least visible vices were in the 80s Wall Street version. But I think you have some corporate excesses probably more in Silicon Valley now than Wall Street. Then again, when you watch Big Short, you fast forward, and I've never read the book. I've watched the movie a million times. Like one of my favorite movies since becoming an adult. And you see those people making those mortgage trades, right before the fall, and just the absolute like lack of self-awareness there. I'm sure it does still exist. But I don't think to the extent it did back in the 80s. I think that was the wealth had just arrived on Wall Street, and you just see this like rush of excess. Like, it talks about the corporate headquarters later that they build, and I think that usually comes, I think, at the onset of great wealth and not as it matures more, maybe.
Yeah. I think fundamentally that ethos is there. I think it's still there. I think it's still like the whole mentality about how we're going to screw over customers. I think fundamentally that's still the case. You're always seeing that people coming up with brand new, like weird financial products and pitching them. And if you kind of peel it back, it's like, oh, well, you're running out of revenue, you're running out of commissions, other businesses are drying up, and you're just inventing new crap that probably isn't going to work, and you're just seeing whatever sticks to the wall, and you're like, and I think that's still, but I just think in the 80s it was just transparent. People were openly, yeah, I'm greedy and this is what I'm doing. And I think now that ethos is there, but it's sneaky. That's kind of what I think about
It's not
it.
as open. It's not as open. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's right. The only thing I'll say is I wonder if so I mean, I think of crypto when you see it.
Hmm.
think of like new financial products, like I immediately think of crypto. And I'm not look, I'm not here. Could there be something to crypto and Bitcoin especially? Sure. Like I'm an agnostic. I'm a agnostic. I stay away from it because I don't really understand it or how to value it. But I'm an agnostic. But when you see these things like fart coins or shit coins or Doge coins and all
Yeah.
these take off, the Haktua coin, and these things take off and they raise like whatever a ridiculous amount of money in a month and then it crashes and you see these pretty blatant pump and dump schemes. I guess like I think that it's kind of maybe shifted from Wall Street to other places and maybe not centered as much on Wall Street as it used to be. Like I think Wall Street in a lot of ways has been defanged because of technology. Like
Mm,
so in the same way, and I wasn't around, so this is just how I understand it. But in the same way, like he would talk about customers would call him and he could manipulate them to buy this bond or that bond and kind of like, and then sometimes it'd just be Salomon Brothers bought some bad bonds and they wanted to get them out. And they would just literally like sell them to the customer. And like, when you start off on Salomon Brothers, Michael Lewis talks about this. He started off as a geek, what you call a geek, and
hmm
you end up if you get to the top, you're a big swinging dick, right? Like that was the
Yeah.
top of the food chain on the trading floor of the Salomon Brothers. That's what they called them.
hmm
So, when you could sell these bad bonds that Salomon Brothers was holding, that's how you became basically a big swinging dick, and you're just
Right.
screwing over customers. And in the same way, like in the 80s, I think you'd call your stockbroker and he'd say, I think you should buy whatever stock at what, and you were like, okay, because they're making killings on commissions and things. They just want you to buy and sell, buy and sell. And I think like now that's largely not as true anymore, just because we've seen like technology create like no commission fees. Like, I can't remember the last time I paid commission to make a trade online.
hmm
And things I don't ever call a broker. I make my own trades, and I think most people index and things like that. I think have maybe defanged Wall Street, and now you just see it in other parts of the country and other parts of the markets.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, you see the beginning of that in the book where he's talking about, for instance, like equity guys were kind of disrespected in the book, where basically in the 70s they had fixed trades. So I forget what the exact amount was, but you would pay hundreds of dollars to do a stock trade. So it was like out of
Right,
reach for most
right.
people. And then they eliminated that in the 70s. Charles Schwab comes along. You can do a trade for like, I think in the beginning it was $50. And I thought that was great. And now they're free. So now it's game over for that. And then the same thing's happening with bonds. So they're moving on towards like they have to invent new products and they have to speculate more and take more risks. So yeah, that's chronicled in the book. Yeah, and I think that's largely true. And I agree, you see it in other areas. And I think there are some wild excesses that happen in Silicon Valley. I agree with you there. I think there's a big drug culture in Silicon Valley. And with crypto, it's totally transparent. It's almost like the 80s on crack, like with with the things you see, with some of the people you see in crypto and some of the wild things they're doing. Yeah, crypto I definitely think is kind of the epicenter of greed today.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and then that's how I see it. Like, I mean, I think it's still there. I mean, there's always going to be greed. There's always going to be people trying to scam people and rip people off, and that is there as much as ever. I just don't know if it's centered as much around Wall Street. I would like to. We said like that. He talks about how Salomon Brothers create the mortgage bond and create a monopoly. I do think there's a lot of interesting things there that they do that I would like to touch on. Like
Sure.
one was like there's this big problem with mortgage bonds, and it's basically that when you have a mortgage, you can just pay it off early. Like if
Mm,
you and so like that was like or refinance at any time and say like, oh, mortgage, I think most homeowners now have experienced this. Like, we bought our home like 8 years ago, and when mortgage rates fell or interest rates fell, and like after COVID, we're like, oh, we should refinance. And so
hmm
that bond now is paid off, and I have another bond. And he's talking about like this is a big problem, and the main reason why nobody wanted to buy mortgage bonds quickly, like he's trying to find the exact quote because mortgage bonds were really cheap and they're talking about like that they're trying to tell investors like how cheap they are but he says you couldn't predict the life of a mortgage bond. It wasn't that prepayments were bad in themselves, it was that you couldn't predict when they would arrive. And if you didn't know when the cash would come back to you, you couldn't calculate the yield. All you could surmise was that the bond would tend to maintain its state of maturity as rates rose and homeowners ceased to prepay, and would shorten as rates fell and homeowners refinanced. This was bad. Though the conditions of supply had changed overnight in October 1981, and that's when the tax breaks had changed and the S&Ls now wanted to sell their mortgage bonds, nobody still wanted to buy them. The conditions of demand for mortgage securities had not. Mortgages indeed were cheap, they were plentiful, yet no one wanted to buy them. And I thought like it was pretty ingenious how they solved this problem. So what they did is like they basically like were able to like one, they building out their research department they had, right? Like Ranieri was like the guy who's heading this up at Salomon Brothers, was just like, this is all about math, guys. So we're just gonna hire these research guys, and like they start to figure it out. Like what neighborhoods were more likely to sell or paid off early than not, what neighborhoods were more likely to move and then like get a new loan somewhere else. And they created a CMO, a collateralized mortgage obligation, and it was invented in June 1983. But not until 1986 did it dominate the mortgage market. The irony is that it achieved precisely what Ranieri had hoped. It made home mortgages look more like other bonds. And then they divided them into tranches. So investors in each tranche, so you said, take a typical $300 million CMO. It would be divided into three tranches or slices of $100 million each. Investors in each tranche received interest payments, but the owners of the first tranche received all principal repayments from all $300 million or mortgage bonds held in trust. Not until first tranche holders were entirely paid off did second tranche investors receive any prepayments. Not until both in first and second tranche investors had been entirely paid off did the holder of a third tranche certificate receive prepayments. And the effect was to reduce the life of the first tranche and lengthen the life of the third tranche. And basically he said, like, so now you basically knew if you're in this first tranche, it was probably going to be paid off early because that's where all the principal payments are going. And they had an estimate. It was like 4 to 5 years or something like that. And then the second tranche was like 5 to 7 years. And then the third tranche was over 7 years. And there was a lot of like really cool, I just thought, innovation around this product to make it work. I mean, they had a lobby for new laws. They had to like create the CMOs, which is a whole new financial product. I mean, they did a lot of work to get this product off the ground, and then of course completely blow it. But like it was cool how they built up the product from basically nothing, where it was illegal in all but 3 states. It was like nobody wanted to sell them. So how did they get around that? They lobbied for a tax break. Nobody wanted to buy them. How did they get around that? They created the CMO and just things like that. It was pretty cool how they built this up.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then that whole system of CMOs eventually leads to the crisis because
Yeah,
they load up those bottom levels with like the worst possible mortgages that you can imagine.
right,
And
right,
yeah,
right.
and that eventually leads, but yeah, in the 80s it solves this big problem. I also thought it was interesting how Louis Ranieri tries to get Congress to pass a law where there are mortgages you can't prepay, which I'm so glad that never happened. That would have been devastating for the
Oh, right,
country.
right, right, right. Like
Yeah,
you could he wanted to like have it where you could take a lower interest rate, but you couldn't prepay it.
right,
Or,
right.
give homeowners that option. And yes, I am glad that was I
Could you
am glad that
imagine like what?
no. No. It had to be substantially cheaper.
So taking aside what we know about like how the crisis blows up and everything, do you think this was a good thing? Do you think that securitizing mortgages and getting all of this capital out there where it was easier to get a mortgage, do you think it was like a good idea that got bastardized like later on, or do you think it was like kind of doomed from the beginning?
So, I mean, look, I'm a capitalist at heart, right?
Yeah,
I want to. I'm a free. I want to have a free market, and I want people to have options how to invest their money. Now there obviously needs to be regulations around that. Like my heart leans libertarian, but my head has seen too many times where that goes off the rails. So you need regulations around these kind of things so that you don't bring down the entire financial industry and all of America, the U.S. finance. That being said, like I like, when you have options to invest your money and as long as it's between consenting parties, and I think that's basically fine, like
Hmm.
yes, some people will lose money on trades and stuff. Just like when I buy a stock, like I might lose money buying that stock, but
Yeah.
like I made that decision and I'm a big boy and I have to take my losses sometimes. But yeah, so I think overall that's good. And like so and I'm a trustee at my pension too, right? And we like having fixed income products, for a pension because like that can solve a lot of our problems with a lot less risk than like the equity markets or other kind of financial investments. So I think the more of this is out there, and certainly mortgages are a huge part of like the overall debt in the US. So if you can have that, I think that can solve problems for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I'm kind of the same way. Like at heart, I have that libertarian view, but over time, I've gotten a little bit more pro regulation. Like, you know,
Right. Yeah,
yeah,
100%. 100%. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Now you like having this out there, like the CMOs and mortgage bonds and things like that?
I'm on the fence. I don't know. Like I kind of look at it this way. Okay, we had a very wild speculative boom where you could basically banks and financial institutions could do whatever they wanted in the 1920s. That leads to the Great Depression eventually. We impose all of these regulations on them. And then we slowly tear those apart from the 80s through the 2000s. And then, like, I don't think it's a coincidence that we like got rid of all the regulation. And then 99 was kind of the cherry on top where we repealed Glass-Steagall and got rid of the separation between commercial and investment banking. I don't think it's a coincidence that 99 you do that. And then a few years later, you have the financial crisis. So, like, I don't know. I tend to think that like a good capital market needs regulation. Like left to its own devices, it's going to do crazy things. It's kind of
No,
where I
absolutely.
stand on it.
Absolutely. I think you really do need regulation around these things. You can't leave people to their own devices, right? And because they will just eventually, as you see in this book, just destroy themselves and bring down a lot of other like people too, like the presidents of the SNL banks, or I don't know if they're rightly called banks, but like the president of the SNL and just how like Wall Street just absolutely raped them and took advantage of them. I think is a very good picture of that.
And that's kind of a prelude to what happens later on in the 2000s, where like those SNLs blow up in the early 90s and late
Yes.
80s. And that needs a government bailout. It's kind of like a baby version of what happens in '08, where like you have all this wild speculation. You're selling you're flooding these SNLs with all these crappy products. And then boom, it all blows up in the early 90s and the government has to bail it out. And then that happens in just a bigger way in 2000s.
So what did you think? What do you think ultimately leads to Salomon Brothers' downfall in the book?
I mean, what I really boil it down to is just the reckless culture of it all. Like now, there's a lot of banks on Wall Street that are probably greedy, that are probably corrupt, but I think that they're smarter about it. Like that, I think that, so, like for instance, a bank like Goldman, it's like there's no doubt that Goldman has greedy people like involved in it, but they're not as like over the top and like self-destructive, I guess would be a good word for it,
Sure.
where I think it really comes down to leadership. So one of the key characters in the book is John Goodfriend, who's the CEO of Salomon Brothers. And I get the impression that he really didn't have control over this thing. Like he was letting it just kind of letting everything happen. And what happened
It
was,
didn't even sound like he understood it.
yeah, yeah. So so this thing basically builds up around him, and it's this crazy bank, and there's all of these different parties, and they're all like kind of like backstabbing each other, and I think that's really it's that culture that Goodfriend started that eventually like leads to the collapse of the whole firm. Like, and it's a lot of it is the infighting that was happening, like getting rid of Louis Verneri. I think that was because, I mean, the book doesn't say this, but I think it's just because Goodfriend felt threatened by him, like, okay, this guy built this whole business and I need to get rid of him, then that's what he does. He's letting people run amok, like, and that's kind of what happens with the treasury bond scandal later on in the early 90s, where this trader was just doing his own thing. And I think it was just this kind of laissez-faire attitude from the top, like, I'm just going to let these people do whatever they want, or I don't have enough control to control anybody that's doing these things, that eventually leads to the downfall of the whole thing. It's just it's a lack of leadership, and it's a poor culture. That's how I would describe it.
I don't disagree with any of that. Do you think their incentive program though, and how they incentivized or compensated maybe the traders who made these trades, like do you think how much of that led to what he do? Because he talks about this and it's hard to parse out, I guess. Well, I guess, and I don't know if Lewis makes any conclusions or definitive conclusions about this, but he talks about their compensation program, which led to like basically these people who had the monopoly on the mortgage bond market at Salomon just basically like left and went to these other firms and created their mortgage bond departments to compete with Salomon.
Yeah, so that's definitely a big part of it, but it's also something that I don't know they could have stopped, because what happens is in the beginning they're trying to basically keep a lid on compensation and keeping it from getting too out of control. And to put it in perspective, so Michael Lewis in the book is making, I think when he gets hired, $42,000 a year, which even adjusted for inflation, I think it's like 120 today, which is like good money, but Manhattan, Wall Street, like that's kind of like nothing today. And back then, though, it's like, oh my God, you're making more money than your
Right,
professor. You're
right,
making
right,
more money
right,
than your mom and dad.
right.
And then by the end of the book, he's making 225,000, and he's like, well, there's someone else making more money. And it's kind of like the compensation gets away from them because other banks start trying to poach their people, and they have to raise this compensation to stay competitive, and it turns into this insane arms race. So I'm not sure what Goodfriend could have really done to stop that problem from raging out of control. I do think kind of like the bigger problem is that they moved from a partnership to a corporation, which is ultimately what happens to all of these Wall Street banks. It's just Solomon's the first to do it, where like in back in the day, you're working for a Wall Street partnership. It's your money at stake in the company. So you're very mindful about the risks that you're taking. Whereas now you're in this era of like just basically free agents where everybody's incentivized to just go out, take the maximum possible risk, get the maximum compensation, and who cares about the long-term consequences, because you're not going to be there. You're probably not going to be there in 5 years. And I think that's more the issue there.
I think you're absolutely right. So like it talks about in 81, good friend makes a deal to like sell the Salomon Brothers to like a larger corporation and he basically cashes out himself. So he gets this huge cash, whatever it was, like multi millions of dollars from this deal. And at that point, you have to wonder how much he was incentivized to take care of the company because he was already rich. But it completely sounds like I think that's what led to the culture change was that now you are no longer, if you're a young trader, your goal isn't to one day become a partner and have long-term wealth as a partner for the rest of your career. The goal was to just like make as much money as you could right away. And it kind of comes to a head talking about like the star trader, first year out of the training program, 1983, and he made $25 million. And so, reading from the book, who really made that money? Howie Rubin, the star trader, or Salomon Brothers? And Rubin's view, it was Howie Rubin. In Goodfriend's view, it was Salomon Brothers. Goodfriend felt the firm created the opportunity for Rubin and therefore deserved the bulk of the rewards. Goodfriend's view, of course, prevailed. The first 2 years out of the training program, Howie Rubin, like all trainees, was placed in a compensation bracket. In his first year, he was paid $90,000, the most permitted a first-year trader. In 1984, his second year, Rubin made $30 million trading. He was then paid $175,000, the most permitted a second-year trader. He recalls, the rule of thumb at Harvard had been that if you are really good, you'll make $100,000 3 years out. The rule of thumb no longer mattered. In the beginning of 1985, he quit Salomon Brothers and moved to Merrill Lynch for a 3-year guarantee, a minimum of $1 million a year plus a percentage of his trading profits. And that begins like this whole exodus of traders from Salomon Brothers to the rest of Wall Street. And that kind of leads to them like losing their hold on the monopoly in the mortgage bond market and the rest of Wall Street like catching up. And you see like the dilemma. I mean, like part of it, like this trader's thinking like, man, I made $30 million for the firm and I'm only getting paid $100,000. That doesn't seem right. And at the same time, I get the company's view. Like, of course, we created you this opportunity. We put you here. Without us, you would never have this opportunity to make $30 million. So without that partnership structure there's nothing for this trader to like, okay, I made this much towards my partnership this year. And like that gets me that much closer. And without that long term there, it was just like, well, shoot, I'm leaving to get, $1 million a year at Merrill Lynch.
Yeah, and Howie Rubin's a good example of this whole dilemma because okay, he makes 30 million bucks and he says, "Well, I'm entitled to a big slice of that." But then at the same time, he's the same guy who winds up losing $250 million later on from
Or
Merrill
Merrill
Lynch,
Lynch.
and he
Yeah.
has none of the losses. He collected all
Right.
this money,
Yeah.
all this
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
compensation,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then okay, that blew up. Well, big deal. Like my money's in the bank. Like it's kind of
Right.
like where
Well,
his
they kind of
attitude.
made it a joke too. Like, right?
Yeah.
You lost $250 million. Like, I lost that much.
Yeah, and like in the partnership era, that stuff that would have imploded the firm. And I kind of agree with Solomon's view and Goodfriend's view that, hey, you're risking firm capital, but at the same time, they're in this dilemma because the other banks are willing to
Right.
hire this guy and they can't hold on to any other good traders.
Later in the book, along comes Milken, and I feel like we have to talk about this because this is like, and look, Amy, and we've talked about investing a million times. Like, I'm a stock guy. I love stocks. I love reading about stock market history or business history. Like last time we talked about a book, we talked about Sam Walton, and I love that stuff, how Sam Walton built up a business. But like the bond stuff, like I just don't know. But I found this very, very interesting how this junk bond trader becomes the king of Wall Street, like the
Hmm.
king of bonds on Wall Street, overtakes Salomon Brothers, and then makes a hostile bid for them. And it just like I found like I didn't know any of this. I didn't know any of this before reading this book. So it was all very new and interesting to me.
Yeah, Milken's very interesting character. For some context, so Milken was basically the king of the junk bond. And like I read a couple books. I read Predator's Ball and Liar and Den of Thieves was the other one. But basically, like Milken's thing was he did this research that showed that like low rated bonds outperform. But the thing was that research was based on kind of these fallen angel bonds. So it's like, highly rated company issues a bond, the company gets into trouble, the bond becomes junk and pays this high interest rate, and then it outperforms. So he took that research and is like kind of turned it into this bastardized product where it was straight up from the beginning, I'm going to have this is junk. Like I'm going to sell this bond and for this really high interest rate. And based on this research that low rated bonds outperform. So anyway, he does that. And basically what that does is it gives all of these corporate raiders ammunition to go out and buy struggling companies. And it creates this takeover wave in the 80s, which was a big part of what fueled the bull market, where you could take like cheap stocks and just call up Michael Milken and say, hey, give me $100 million to buy this crap company, and then I'm going to liquidate it or try to turn it around. And it turned into kind of a frenzy on Wall Street. Long story short, like what he was also doing was he was involved in insider trading. So he was buying these stocks before they had to take over. Ivan Boesky was another one who was basically using all this inside information to do that. Eventually, Milken goes to jail, but at this point, he's the king of Wall Street and he's doing all this. And then he sets his sights on the biggest bank, the biggest investment bank that exists. And Warren Buffett ultimately stops the whole thing. But yeah, that's kind of the story of Michael Milken. He was fueling this other frenzy that was happening in the equity market.
Right. And so he wrote this book before Milken went to jail, which was
Yeah,
interesting because so you see like at the time, like Milken's just like, wow, like look at his vision and things like that. And he compensated. So we were talking about the compensation question at Salomon Brothers. Milken just takes the opposite view. He's like, hey, you make $100 million, I'm going to pay you whatever millions of dollars in return, like as compensation. So he's getting some of the top talent, right, in from Wall Street, because his compensation program is, like that's the best compensation people can find. And he's all in junk bonds. And I his story ends up like not going well. But I do like how he describes, like, hey, this guy just had the vision, like, to look at the business, the business quality, like as we would as like investors in a business. I think, like, say like, hey, this company's good or this company's bad. I really like this. Michael Milken was building a business rather than making an endless series of trades. He's willing to look up from the blips on his trading screen and think clear and complete thoughts years into the future. Would a certain microchip company survive for 20 years to meet its semi-annual interest payments? Would the U.S. steel industry survive in any form? Fred Joseph, who became CEO of Drexel, that's a competing bond firm, listened to Milken on the subject of corporations and thought he understood credit better than anyone in the country. As a byproduct, Milken came to understand companies. He says, he goes, Michael Lewis goes on, we at Salomon, as I have said, relegated the equity department to a corner in our basement. Many of our bond traders thought of our corporate financiers as administrative assistants. Their pet name for the corporate finance department was Team Xerox. Anyone who might have seen what Milken saw never reached a position to do anything about it. That was a great shame because it left us blind to a prize within our reach.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, no doubt Milken was a genius. He was a really smart dude who built this whole thing. And he was very forward thinking. It's just he was breaking the law. And that's what, I guess it's another thing, like culture and
Culture
character,
matters, right? Right,
all that
right.
stuff matters no matter how smart you are.
And I think it's hard to, when there's that kind of money and being made in investing. I mean, that's going to corrupt the culture too, even if you have a good culture. I mean, that's hard to like maintain a good culture. And when you make a $100 million bond trade in a matter of, a day or two.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and ultimately, interestingly, it was Rudy Giuliani who actually was that his own character arc. He's the guy who put a lot of these guys in prison back then. So that's a pretty interesting wrinkle to the whole thing.
Yeah, it's
But
crazy. Like if you just continue the story, just how many people make cameos into it or play
yeah,
a part in it. Like, when Warren Buffett came up, like again, I had no idea where this book was going. I'm like, and I kind of knew, look, I will say, I kind of knew Warren Buffett had a stint at Salomon Brothers, but I didn't know when or how. So when he came up and like I saw how he did get into Salomon Brothers, I was like, that's interesting.
so back to Charlie Munger, who we talked about earlier. I thought there's this interesting part of the snowball where they're buying Salomon Brothers, and Charlie and Warren are looking out at this floor, and there's people cursing and screaming, and there's smoke everywhere. And Charlie Munger, who I think knew this was a bad idea, says to Warren, like, "You sure you want to do this? Like, this is what you want to invest in?" And Warren's like, "Yeah." And like I think Charlie Munger like had that foresight to know that like kind of character is destiny and this is a bad idea, but Warren
Right,
had to learn it on his own.
right. Like even when it can pay financially, sometimes it's just not worth it.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And Warren learned that lesson. Man, he learned it the hard way. He had a pretty miserable couple of years, and I'm sure he wishes he never touched the thing.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. It sounds like it. In this book, it only really touches on, it doesn't go into all that. So it's interesting that,
Yeah,
that stuff and can provide, like what happens after Buffett bails them out.
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I thought this was a good conversation about the book. I mean, is there any other themes or anything you wanted to talk about with this?
No, I mean, like I have a million notes on this, and it was
Yeah.
all very interesting. The color, some of the anecdotes provide, like like the gluttony and the like the goofs and the pranks they play on each other, like to really paint the culture. It is, I mean, it's amusing, it's entertaining, but I think we touched on all the really, really big themes here.
Cool. Yeah. So for the audience, I definitely recommend this book. Very entertaining, gives you a real glimpse into a world that's very different from what most people probably experienced. And that I'd also recommend. So Lewis has this podcast called Against the Rules, And there's a few episodes in there where he has interviews with characters from the book. So like the human piranha, he actually has an interview with this guy today.
Nice.
So
Nice.
if you want to check that out, I recommend it.
I'm gonna
But
have to check that out for sure.
yeah, it was cool. So yeah, so thanks for coming on today discussing this book with me. Any things that you'd like to talk about? Any projects you're working on?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm at Long Term Mindset, and you can find us at longtermmindset.co. And we have a bunch of resources for just like investors that want to educate themselves, like how to like value companies and how to read financial statements. And just, we don't give stock recommendations. That's not what we do, but we have a premium community too, centered around these products where they can always ask questions and get further training on important topics like how to learn how to make your own investments. And like I said, you can find us on longtermmindset.co.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on today and have a good one.
Thank you so much for having me, Value Stock Geek.